capacity? I suppose yes, but there's no argument. I mean, it's distributed, to everyone equally who has it. It's 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, as it were, arithmetically equal. Yeah. But then there are those who don't have it, and presumably in relation to some kind of solidarity or empathy of some sort, or some kind of concern or care has to be directed. So it's equally distributed. So therefore, I take your point. Strictly speaking, yes, I suppose there is an equality of something, but that's not then a space for argument about how that's distributed in the way that it is.
How we might share it out because it's a priori.
Or liberal egalitarians and so on.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Any further questions?
Yeah. A short question, because you used the term self-transformation of the oppressed, and my question would be towards what? Because I don't really fully, I think, understand this concept of self-transformation of the oppressed, because it's basically puts them even more down, because they need to be, or I might have not understood fully the thing. What is meant by this phrase, self-transformation of the oppressed?
Yeah, I think what I mean by it, because it's my term to justify it. It's the moments at which the sans-paurs become aware of that which they haven't got as inequality, and that in itself, that awareness is it somehow changes them and impels them into subjectivation.
Then they get to desire to transform to the thing they are not. Or do you mean it's like this?
Well, not necessarily that they would seek then to become oppressors in their own right, but that they would simply seek to enter the space of politics.
But exactly, they would kind of develop a desire to appropriate this category that they don't have.
They would have the desire to redress the wrong which has constituted them as they are, as the oppressed. I mean, as I said, Rancière's interest in them disappears at the point at which they get, just before they enter the space of politics and of recognition, just before they become political subjects, as it were. He's only interested in when they are sans-paurs. So, is it behind your question? You were saying that could be very depressing.
No, my problem is that it's basically something that becomes desirable to enter this category, as if it was necessary to desire it. Or the question would be, my question, maybe one could make a step back and not even desire to enter this category, because this is I find problematic. This wanting to self-transformation kind of. I don't know if
I suppose if you didn't desire, if you didn't want to, if you didn't experience it as a, if you didn't experience something as an inequality, if you didn't experience the toil, then you wouldn't be a sans-paurs. So you have a very kind of.
No, it's not about that you don't experience. It's simply something that you want. That become almost as something better that you want to enter this category. And my kind of position would be just to make a kind of step back and not even want it.
You could be content in your being oppressed. Is that? You could. I suppose, but it wouldn't be. Is that?
Or Deleuze would say you would clear off and do something else instead. Yeah, that your step back could be is not playing the game, isn't it? But sorry.
Just to pursue that point a little bit, if I may. This idea of the experience of being oppressed. Does Rancière have an account of kind of false consciousness? something like you get from the Marxian traditional or Althusser's notion of an imaginary relationship, such that you could be unequal and oppressed, but actually be part of the situation, but identify it in such a way so that you don't feel your oppression or your inequality. So a female subject who identifies with a certain set of heterosexual, heteronormative, sort of phallocentric norms, which doesn't feel oppressed, but one might argue certainly is, or working class subject who is sort of identified quite happily with the norms of bourgeois ideology in such a way that they don't feel their oppression or a certain kind of exclusion. So does he have some kind of notion that would perhaps come from his relationship to Althusser, which could account for that? And if not, is he assuming then at that moment of the experience of oppression that it's either just a kind of a given, an evidence, that if you experience exclusion, it's a kind of a foundational moment which is just a pure evidence, a pure sort of presence to consciousness of one's exclusion, which will be the building blocks of this process of subjectivation? And if that's so, is there not a risk that the subject of emancipation is already a subject in their awareness of their exclusion, and the whole process of subjectivation is not rather circular, because it presupposes a subject who's aware of their exclusion in the first place? And that circularity is sort of potentially sort of inconsistent or problematic.
To answer the point on Althusser first and false consciousness, no, there isn't an account of false consciousness in Rancière, absolutely not. And in fact, this is one of the ways in which he pushes against Althusser very hard, so that he's absolutely convinced against someone like Althusser, and specifically Bourdieu in particular, that the problem that the sans-power have is not being aware of what causes their oppression. They're perfectly aware of it. It's just that they can't do anything about it until they have this kind of transformative moment in which they declare their equality. They're aware of they're aware of their oppressed situation. So I suppose in some sense they do. But the subject of, it's all on the surface. There's nothing hidden that will need a sociological inquiry of Bourdieusian kind to find out the reasons for. Rancière is very clear that he thinks that, but it's also clear that political subjects, they don't magically come into being from nothing. It's not ex nihilo. There are what in fact happens is a transformation of, for instance, one of the examples he gives is the use of the word proletarian or proletariat. That it doesn't exist, but when it comes into being, it defines a transformed. There is a new being. But obviously it comes from work. There were workers there before. It's not that they came out. Does that?
Well, it does, but I think it sort of begs further questions, because there's a question of how far does he account for this coming of the new? Where does it come from? And if he, as was my feeling, that he does lack this account of false consciousness, how are we to sort of account for, the alienated work or the alienated sort of female subject? How are we to account for that they suddenly sort of start off on this process? Could it easily not happen? Does it require some kind of Yakuto figure? We've talked about the mentally incapable never perhaps having this capacity, and perhaps animals, and then that would say, well, perhaps people can have solidarity with those categories and do it for them. If you have someone doing this for those who are suffering from false consciousness, then immediately there's an introduction of a certain kind of elitism there, because there's someone who's guiding those who are in false consciousness. So I mean, if you compare it to someone like Badiou, who has got a very clear account of the way something comes from nothing, the way change, can suddenly erupt as a